Welcome back, everybody, to our final session of the conference, Joining the Circle of the System. It's been a pretty interesting 8-week journey we've had. A lot of really good papers and great questions and great engagement. I am myself surprised over how, despite the awkward setting of all of us having to look at objects all day, there's subjectivity shining through in our discussions and the concept. So I look forward to the final round today. So I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Angelica Nuzzo. She is a professor at City University of New York. She has published widely on German Idealism, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, modern philosophy, ethics, and political philosophy, and also on translation, philosophy of translation. She's published books such as Approaching Hegel's Logic Obliquely, Melville, Molière, and Beckett, published by CUNY Press 2018, Hegel on Religion and Politics, also by CUNY Press, and Memory, History, Justice, and Hegel, by Palgrave Macmillan, 2012, Hegel and the Analytic Tradition, by Continuum, 2009. So there's she's done lots of great work and great scholarship on Hegel, and we're really glad to have her with us here today. Her paper today is titled Hegelian Systematicity, Questions of Beginnings and Questions of Ends, which is very fitting given that today's the final session. So without further ado, please, Angelica, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me begin not directly with Hegel, but still in a very Hegelian way. Not with philosophy, but with poetry, still a form of absolute spirit. What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. And every phrase and sentence that is right, where the word is at home, every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning, every poem an epitaph. End and beginning imply each other, entail each other, are unavoidably interconnected and intertwined. Somehow they even converge and are one. To make an end is to make a beginning. This is the nature of systematicity. This is the nature of thinking, and consequently, this is ultimately the nature of philosophy itself. The figure of the circle is often invoked by Hegel and by interpreters alike to account for the peculiar predicament that most generally seems to tie the end to the beginning and vice versa. But then, in the very moment it is invoked, the circle's geometry is also proclaimed in need of correction. Properly, the circle is a circle of circles, a spiral, a sphere, the movement of the circle, circular movement, or the drawing of the circle. It is not a static, accomplished line. The need for correction is revealing here. Hegel's circle, or dialectic speculative thinking's peculiar form of circularity, is not really or not quite a circle. Now, obviously, there is no beginning and no end in the circle, or in the circle considered mathematically. There may be one for the hand that draws the circle or for its construction, but this is a different issue. On the other hand, it is also clear that before being concluded in its full circularity, the circle is not a circle. And then there is another major and equally obvious difficulty. We all know this, although we rarely recognize it, caught as we often are in the satisfaction offered by the image of the circle. But despite the repeated promises and reassurances, in Hegel's philosophy, no matter at what point and in what sphere we are, the end of a movement never really goes back or turns back to the beginning. Not at least, but importantly, if we are to invoke circularity, to the same identical beginning from which that end has issued, as its conclusion or result. In fact, as the end turns back to the beginning, formally, a new and different beginning is made, materially. This means then that the end does not go back to the beginning after all, unless we speak ambiguously of the beginning. An open circle is simply not a circle. But if it is so, what does it mean that the end turns back to the beginning? What makes of the declared end an end and of their assumed beginning a beginning? The first relevant question here concerns the way in which the beginning and the end are interconnected for dialectic speculative thinking and in the activity of such thinking. The second is a question of why they are interconnected, given that such a connection is in fact all but obvious and certainly much more complex than suggested by the straightforward image of the circle. And finally, we should ask whether beginning and end can be thought one without the other, or alternatively, as leading to different beginnings and ends than one would expect when invoking the image of perfect circularity. To be sure, to address these questions means to rethink Hegelian circularity and systematicity in general. But if these questions are asked from the specific standpoint of the conclusion of the encyclopedia, it also means to go a step further in the understanding of what the beginning and the end may be as beginning and ends in philosophy and of philosophy, for Hegel as much as for ourselves after Hegel, or indeed after the end of Hegel's philosophy. At stake, most generally, is a question of method. I have the leisure here of being able to tackle this very general problem since I come at the end of this months-long conference. At this point, all the salient detail issues raised by the conclusive text of the encyclopedia have been successfully discussed and addressed. So here I come questioning the end as such, the end thematizing the end, thought actually thinking itself. In what follows, I address these questions by taking up the methodological issue of the end. I developed this issue in the more specific direction of the end of philosophical thinking, the end made by philosophical thinking, the end of which philosophical thinking is responsible. It is in this respect that the issue of the beginning arises. I believe I have already answered the question posed by the conference. The end of Hegel's philosophy in the encyclopedia does not go back to the beginning of the logic, Sein, reines Sein. The issue then is an apparently simple one. Does the end of philosophy, the end in the idea of philosophy, go back to a beginning at all, formally? And in the case it does, what is that beginning, materially? With what or where does the end of dialectic speculative thinking leave us subjectively? But even before getting to these questions, I shall ask, again quite generally, what does it mean, what can it mean for philosophy to reach the end, or rather to actively make an end? What is it that properly ends the encyclopedia book, Philosophy as System of Philosophy, the mode of thinking philosophically as such, the mode of grasping philosophically determinate contents, the contents which philosophical thinking actually and conceptually grasps? In this paper, I developed two claims. My first general claim is that in the conclusion of the encyclopedia, in the fully realized idea of philosophy, dialectic speculative thinking makes an end by going back to the end of the logic, namely to the absolute method in the three moments of beginning, advancement, end. In particular then, the end of philosophical thinking connects back methodologically to the formal moment of the beginning as such, namely to the pure action of beginning. Indeed, to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. What we have in the conclusion of Absolute Spirit is, for the first time, a presentation of the fully developed method of philosophical thinking as such. Thus, in the first step of my argument, I discuss the feature of the logical absolute method that become relevant for and are significantly taken up in the philosophical method. In the final stage of the encyclopedia, the philosophical method requires thinking to take a further last step after having developed philosophy throughout the logic or the science of logic, the philosophy of nature, the philosophy of spirit. Thinking must now conclusively make the end by retroactively reflecting and taking up in its entirety the road that has heretofore been traveled, meta odos, as a spurious etymology has it. Accordingly, in the second part of my argument, I look more specifically at the end made this time by philosophical thinking, the end that philosophical thinking is conclusively in charge of performing. I'm interested in the lesson that we can gather from Hegel in order to bring philosophy with Hegel up to pace in a very different world, in a very different present. Here I place the question of the beginning to which that end allegedly leads. This time, the material or content-determined beginning. My second claim then is that the beginning to which the end of Hegel's philosophy opens up is the beginning that we, philosophers after Hegel, are charged with undertaking. So to the first part, logical method and the method of philosophical thinking. The logic ends with the chapter on the absolute idea, which turns out to be absolute method. Method, Hegel announces, is mode and modality, Modalität and Art und Weise, of both cognition and being. Three are the moments in which the absolute method unfolds: Anfang, Fortgang, Ende. As many of you know, I have been thinking about the method for a long time, and presently I shall dwell only on those features of the logical method that become relevant for the philosophical method at the end of the encyclopedia. For Hegel, the necessity of placing a thematization of the method at the end of the logic is grounded on the immanence that guides thinking's discursive movement of self-determination throughout different spheres. This means two things. For one, there is no beginning, no advancement, no end for a form of thinking that is intuitive and not discursive. Beginning, advancing, and end apply only to the unfolding of a discrete discursive process. For another thing, as discursive thinking is itself the development of an immanent process, there is no beginning, no advancement, and no end within the process itself while the process unfolds. In other words, there is no beginning, advancement, end in and for the position of immanence. Significantly, the end, and more generally the structures of the method, become apparent only once the end has already been reached, namely, once a process has reached its fulfilled completion. Furthermore, the end becomes apparent only within a direct thematization of or reflection upon the act of ending. Now, the thematization of the act of ending confirms, but also at the same time interrupts the position of immanence, as it sanctions a radical discontinuity within it, the emergence from it, as it were. Such thematization implies the recollection or retroactive gathering of the entire process that has led to thinking's final predicament, which only at this point can be explicitly marked as the end. In this respect, Hegel suggests that ending is the act of going back, which is properly the reflective movement of coming to itself, zu sich selbst kommen. This is the moment in which the structure of the system first emerges. Thereby, the logic is reconfigured as a system of totality, says Hegel, the system of totality of logical determination, namely as a system of totality encompassing all the preceding logical determination. Significantly, Hegel does not describe the system that arises once the end is reached in terms of the movement of the closure of the circle, but rather in terms of the apparently opposite movement of expansion, Erweiterung, whereby the system of totality is generated. Hegel announces that in such an expansion, the formal determination of the method, specifically the form of the end, is connected to a new and richer content. Formal Erweiterung is material Bereicherung. It is here that the possibility and perhaps the necessity of a new beginning is synthetically nested. It is only at the end of the logic that the absolute idea is able to attain the overarching form of truth, or truth in its full logical completion, alle Wahrheit, and to perform the highest form of free action. Properly, it is only such a free action that can be said absolute, thereby sanctioning the end of the logical process. The logical end demands thinking's absolutely free action. Such an action is itself the end. It is neither a beginning allegedly pronounced absolute, Schelling's absolute or the absolute of intellectual intuition, nor the Abgrund of an absolute posited as the end of all things, but itself incapable of making a new beginning. Spinoza's absolute as absolute undifferentiated substance. Only the free action of the absolute idea as absolute method can sanction the end of logic as a whole, thereby positing that the shape of all truth is to be the system of totality. Such an action is free in the sense of being capable of generating an utterly new beginning. Freedom is, at the same time, the capacity to make the end and the capacity of sheer novel creation. This radically dialectical act entails the movement, or properly the decision, Entschluss, of letting go, frei entlassen. Hegel presents the end of the logic, or its highest, indeed absolute truth, in apparently simple terms. As the idea posits itself as the absolute unity, this is a quote, of the pure concept and its reality, and thus gathers itself in the immediacy of being, it is in this form as the totality, nature. The idea gathers or collects itself, and in so doing it recollects the overall development that has made it what it truly is, namely the absolute unity of concept and reality. The immediacy of being is now the totality that the idea itself simply and immediately is. It is now clear what we call the beginning is often the end. The totality of the idea is nature. Notice, however, that Hegel does not formulate such an identity propositionally. There is no predication here. The idea in this form as the totality, nature. There is instead a break. This signals a pause in the idea's recollecting act. The pause produces a sort of identification, or perhaps only a suggestion, a hint towards a new creative act, which is no longer an act of logical thinking, the signal that the end has indeed occurred. What we have here is rather, Hegel says, the act of zeigen, the act of pointing to and imagining a new beginning, the hint towards a new way that comes afterwards. Such a zeigen is a different, indeed logically unprecedented act of intuiting, an intuition, Anschauung, that discloses a new horizon for thinking, knowing, acting, and being. This new horizon is nature. The action with which the idea makes an end, Hegel says, is neither a having become, geworden sein, nor a transition, Übergang, in the strict sense. It is instead a movement that points to the apparently opposite direction. It is a prospective movement of absolute liberation. Since this final liberation is not the positing of a determination that is still immediate or not yet permeated by the concept, as is the case at each and every step within the logical process, I quote again, in this freedom, there is no transition that takes place. This freedom is therefore complete. In it, there is no passing over into something other, nor refutation is needed to further complete it. Such freedom displays the permanence of the eternal presence proper to the predicament of being with oneself in otherness. The end in its absoluteness is not a transition, but the liberating gesture that hints to another utterly unprecedented way of acting and being, a way that is not yet there, not even in outline, indeterminately or immediately, but must be entirely invented, imagined anew. As the idea in a final act of freedom determines itself to simple being, this remains, Hegel says, completely transparent to it, and is the concept that in its determination remains with itself, der bei sich selbst bleibende Begriff. Indeed, to remain with oneself is no transition and no becoming. It is rather another expression for the highest freedom caught in its concluding act, to be with oneself in otherness. In the idea that is active as eternally or permanently with and for itself, logical thinking finds its end. And in this end, discursivity yields to its opposite or other. The idea, maintains Hegel in the conclusion of the Encyclopedia Logic, is anschauen, and the intuiting idea is nature. And yet, Hegel suggests that if there is in fact a transitioning in the action of making the end, a movement that is indeed dialectically nested in the very form of the end as end, ending is unending, it should be taken, he says, in the sense that the idea freely lets go of itself, sich selbst freiend lässt, absolutely certain of itself and internally at rest. The idea's absolute liberation is the act whereby the idea frees itself from itself. Having fulfilled its logical task, it absolves and unbounds itself from it, and is now both retrospectively free from it and prospectively free for a new life, a new destination, and a new task. Such is the dialectical duplicity of the end. In its freedom, the idea lets itself go, or lets go of itself, as it has been as logical idea, and lets itself go as something utterly other, nature. Finally, the letting go and letting be that describes the ending action of the idea's absolute freedom is Entschluss. This is the act of freedom that by ending makes a thoroughly new beginning. Properly, the movement beyond the end begins with both the idea's Entschluss and its Befreiung. Decision and liberation disclose nature and spirit beyond the idea's logical end. So now to the second part, making the end, philosophy and its method. The expansion of the logical method to philosophical method. At the end of the encyclopedia, the movement of dialectic speculative thinking goes back to the method of logical thinking, thereby producing a thematization of the method of philosophical thinking as such. This is the second claim I want to discuss in what follows. Now the question concerns the ways in which the absolute method of the logic shapes more specifically the method of philosophy once at stake is philosophical thinking's act of making the end, namely of bringing the encyclopedia to conclusion, thereby achieving the complete system of the science. Unlike the end of the logic, and unlike the conclusion of each one of the preceding encyclopedic spheres, the end made in and by the idea of philosophy does not seem to point to a genuinely new beginning. For a new beginning can, at this point, only be extra systematic, hence necessarily non-immanent. It seems then that at this point we must have reached an absolute end of sort. Hence, the important question concerns whether there is, nonetheless, a transitioning, an Übergehen, to which the idea of philosophy points, perhaps in the prospective gesture of a Zeigen in making the end. An Übergehen similar to the one taking place at the end of the logic. In other words, can one formulate a final dialectical contradiction in the form of the end of philosophical thinking, which is analogous to the contradiction that propels the logic on to the philosophy of nature? There is no Übergang to something other, and yet there is a sort of Übergehen in which an utterly new beginning is made. If this is the case, then, is this final step necessarily entailed in the methodological idea of the end made by philosophical thinking, a form of thinking that is discursive and dialectic speculative? Or is it rather incompatible with such an end, namely with it being a true or absolute end? As we reach the thematization of philosophy, Hegel says, unity of art and religion, philosophy has been actually at work all along, unfolding throughout the entire movement of the encyclopedia. Starting with an introductory notion of philosophy and philosophical thinking, the encyclopedia has been, it is now clear, the process in which philosophical thinking has concretely displayed its immanent movement of determination, finally reaching the conceptual apprehension of its own concept. Following a familiar logic, such a concept now needs to be fully realized or actualized into idea. Paradoxically, however, such actualization seems to have already happened, its movement throughout the encyclopedia yielding precisely the concept of philosophy. In other words, in the case of philosophy, the genesis of the concept seems to be the same process as the concept's actualization to idea. It is partly for this reason that the thematic philosophical cognition, thus erkennen, of the contents of the highest expressions of absolute spirit, namely poetry and religious revelation, is declared to be the anerkennen of these same contents, as well as of all the previous contents that are now determined or indeed recognized as being themselves the productions of philosophical thinking. In effect, the movement of philosophy, Hegel maintains, findet sich schon vollbracht, has already happened and is already completed in the very moment in which it is programmatically formulated as a task. And yet, the last sections of the encyclopedia do in fact have a novel task in front of them. At stake in the realization of the concept of philosophy to idea is something that, in a sense, has not yet happened. At stake is the reappropriation of the already completed movement of philosophical thinking in a reflective act of conscious self-recognition. This is now the method. In this conclusive step, by thematizing the concept of philosophy, philosophical thinking shall produce the actuality of the idea of philosophy, thereby bringing to light the method that has guided the entire previous movement of the science. Thus, what can be called the second actualization of the concept of philosophy into idea is the development of the specific method of philosophy. This is now the retrospective reflection on the way in which thinking has immanently moved through the different spheres of logic, nature, spirit, thereby achieving its completion. Within this framework, logic, nature, spirit are now taken up again by philosophical thinking as the specific contents of the science of logic, the philosophy of nature, the philosophy of spirit. The idea of philosophy is the self-awareness of that which philosophical thinking has accomplished so far, a self-awareness that is one with the consciousness of the way, odos, in which such contents and their cognition have in effect been successively produced and actualized as properly philosophical contents. Method is this active, performative self-awareness. It is the awareness generated by thinking's final action of running through, indeed a second time, the process that has produced it. And yet, the act of running through the process that has conclusively generated the concept of philosophy is not the identical repetition of the immanent movement here concluded. It is, instead, both its radical deconstruction and its reconstruction in an utterly new form and figure. I have extensively shown that and how this happens in the logic through the absolute method. At the end of the encyclopedia, the deconstructive reenactment of the overall movement of philosophical thinking that is now for the first time established in the form of the system of philosophy is the movement of the three syllogisms. Here you can say, we go back to the beginning with Kevin's paper. In this regard, I want to make only the following 2 points, which are relevant to the argument that follows. First, the syllogism is a formal structure of discursivity, namely of discursive thinking and reason. Second, the combination of the 3 different positions that logic, nature, spirit occupy in the syllogistic movement that articulates the conclusion of the encyclopedia offers precisely the account of the deconstructive, out-of-sequence way, as it were, in which philosophical thinking methodologically takes up what it has previously achieved in order to bring the system to its end. So now my last section, making the end, philosophy's end and the new beginning. The formal moments of the method, we know from the logic's absolute method, are beginning, advancement, end. It is only in the conclusion of the encyclopedia that it makes systematic and immanent sense to speak of beginning, advancement, and end in the progressive, self-constructing process of philosophical thinking. All other employments of these notions before the conclusion of the encyclopedia can only be introductory, anticipatory, or historical. At this point, philosophical thinking must address the question of philosophy's end methodologically. In so doing, the end is actually made. Just as in the logic, making the end implies both the movement of zu sich selbst kommen of philosophical thinking and the Erweiterung or expansion, whereby the system of philosophy is first instituted in its concluded form. If a closure is involved here, it is dialectically a closure that implies a fundamentally expansive act. Systematicity is a formal aspect of the methodological end. The movement of the end, however, displays both a formal and a material or content-determined aspect. Let me start with the general formal question of the end of philosophy, which is immediately connected with the question of contents. What does it mean for philosophy to make the end? What does it mean that philosophy has reached the end? That we have reached the end in matters of philosophy, in der Sache Philosophie, as it were. Unlike all other ends that seal the preceding spheres of the science, ends that always imply the transition to another element of determination and other forms of cognition, being and action, hence to the next systematic sphere, at stake in the idea of philosophy, I have already suggested this, is a somehow absolute and certainly unprecedented end. It is an end that by definition is not followed by anything still belonging to the all-encompassing system. There is, however, nothing that is not encompassed by the system, which is instituted precisely as the system of totality is reached, from which it follows that the end must be absolute. In this regard, the end of philosophy differs from all preceding intra-systematic ends. To claim that the logic has reached the end, for example, means in the most general sense that no further determination can be attained, that it's still a determination of logical thinking. That is, it means that logical thinking has completed its task as logical thinking. All successive determinations are accordingly non-logical, but something else, or something else in addition, namely determinations of nature or spirit. They are determination of thinking as and in nature and spirit. Similarly, to claim, for instance, that art as form of absolute spirit systematically ends means that the way of apprehension and production of contents proper of absolute spirit in the medium of intuition has been exhausted. Namely, it means that whatever new forms of apprehensions and production are generated after the end of art are no longer forms of art as initially defined, but rather religious or philosophical forms of absolute spirit, self-knowledge and self-awareness. To be sure, there is a sense in which this meaning of making the end holds for philosophy as well. Philosophy systematically ends when its conceptual apprehension and production of contents in their rational principles is complete. It is important to stress here that Hegel underlines how the encyclopedia deals with the principles of the philosophical science, not with the infinite breadth of empirical details. It is the encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences im Grundwissen. In the case of the idea of philosophy, however, the question remains of what happens after the end, namely of whether, even assuming that there is no proper Übergehen in the idea of philosophy, one can still construe a dialectical Übergang of sort, the movement to a new beginning. It seems, however, that even though such a non-transitioning transition is consistent with the end of Hegel's philosophy, it is not made by the idea of philosophy itself. In this case, it would be possible to think of new forms of apprehension and production of contents that are non-philosophical and non-conceptual, but something else, something unprecedented and entirely extra-systematic. The intriguing question in this regard concerns what exactly those forms of non-philosophical or extra-philosophical thinking may be. We are, it seems, by definition, outside of Hegelian territory. but maybe not just quite. Before turning to this latter issue, which I will address really briefly, and in order to address it, let me briefly insist on 2 points. First, the normativity of the methodological moment of the end implies that philosophy must end, namely must reach a conclusion. Importantly, at stake here is philosophy considered in its idea, not philosophy taken empirically or historically as a contingent individual activity. To appreciate this point, consider Hegel's conception of the idea and the idea of philosophy in contrast to Kant's idea as Vernunftbegriff. The idea of philosophy or philosophical thinking in its highest principle is not the open-ended, infinite, but in fact indefinite movement of approximation of a Sollen. It is not the pursuit of an ideal good not belonging to this world, but it is also not the perpetual running through the same circle. So here think of the claim that Kant has in the Methodenlehre, the first critique, that philosophy doesn't exist, okay? There is no philosophy as an idea doesn't exist. There are philosophers who philosophize. There is the activity of philosophizing. So for Hegel instead, the conclusiveness of the end in the idea of philosophy is the achieved self-referentiality of thinking's worldly movement of coming to itself. This is properly actualized freedom. It is the expansiveness of the highest form of freedom. At this point, thinking is finally satisfied with what it has accomplished. For here, the word is at home. Thinking is finally at home. As claimed at the end of the logic, in this freedom, there is no transition that takes place. This freedom, as opposed to the freedom manifested at any preceding moment of the process, is complete. But freedom is active. The absolute, non-transitional end is an activity. In its conclusiveness, then, freedom's expansion must hint at the new beginning. This latter is implied by the normativity of the methodological end. In its satisfaction in the idea, the only thing left to philosophical thinking is to let go all it has achieved, to let go of itself, again, and in the most definitive sense, frei entlassen. This is, to be sure, the true end. The second point concerns, briefly, the discursive character of philosophical thinking in its idea. As the most extensive actualization process that has taken place retrospectively throughout the encyclopedia, philosophy is discursive thinking. In addition, in its idea, philosophy finally displays its full-fledged discursivity in the conclusive deconstructive account of such process staged in the 3 syllogisms. In the end, however, discursivity as such is dialectically revoked, yielding to its other, namely intuition. The end of the logic opens up to a similar intuitive new beginning. Thus, both in the end of logical thinking and in the end of philosophical thinking, the methodological end implies a new beginning, hinted at intuitively by the freedom of the action of frei entlassen. The last question we need to address then is how this movement takes place in the conclusion of the encyclopedia. In the personal notes in the Notizen that Hegel added to the last paragraph of his handbook for 77 in the 1817 edition, on the occasion of the 1818-1819 lectures on the Encyclopédie, we find a suggestive textual basis for addressing this last question. Hegel reflects on the act whereby philosophy itself finally fulfills its idea through an act of self-transcendence. That is, at the same time, the act of transcending the philosophical system just instituted, thereby making a new beginning. Hegel's notes state that the three standpoints, okay, that's Hegel's words, the three standpoints expressed in the three syllogisms are now united in one, sind in einem vereinigt, and that this unifying one is the one idea, the eine Idee, that presents itself and that is in the development through the different sphere at once moment. The crucial remark, though, is in the following statement. Diese Idee ist Überblick. Now, Überblick is the comprehensive methodological grasp of the whole that emerges only at the end. But Überblick is properly the final, all-encompassing intuition of the whole, not its conceptual apprehension. Überblick is Anschauung. This is specifically intellectual intuition. As Hegel explains with regard to the universal concept in the logic, intuition is the immediate grasp of a totality. When this totality is objective and not merely sensible, and is the unchanging reality and truth, the Realität that is proper of the idea, then this is, Hegel says, intellectual intuition. To be sure, intuition has neither beginning nor end, nor obviously Fortgang. Only discursive thinking does. Accordingly, intuition designates the space, or rather the point, of an eternal present, in itself such as to entail the Aufhebung of beginning and end as methodological forms of discursive thinking. This is the Aufhebung, or indeed the end of discursivity, enacted, however, by discursive thinking itself in its highest idea. What we have here is indeed intellectual intuition. This is the way in which philosophical cognition makes the end, not as the result of the preceding movement, but as the absolute beginning of the utterly new dimension of its own eternal present and eternal presence. In performing its final Überblick, the idea of philosophy yields to its other. Discursivity yields to intuition, or rather is finally integrated into the intuitive grasp of the whole, thereby transcending it. In the end, the Überblick of the whole is the intuitive version and counterpart of its concluding discursive articulation in the three syllogisms. In both cases, philosophical thinking performs the movement of the end. The title Hegel gives to this private Notiz is relevant. He says, Bild der vernünftigen Weltanschauung durch Begriffen derselben. The Anschauung that seals philosophical cognition in its end, presenting it as Überblick of the whole, is properly Weltanschauung. The idea of philosophy concluded in this way is Hegel's rational Weltbegriff thereof. It is not an otherworldly idea, as Kant's idea of philosophy, but the idea of an activity deeply engaged in the world. In the end, however, the Weltanschauung to which philosophical cognition yields is a rational intuition of the whole in images. It is Bild. This is indeed the way Hegel concludes section 577 of the 1831 edition. We have heard comments and discussions about this through this 2 months. Die ewige an und für sich seiende Idee sich ewig als absoluter Geist betätigt, erzeugt und genießt. The eternal idea in and for itself is eternally active as absolute spirit, and as such creates and enjoys itself. This is no longer conceptual language, but is the language of images and intuition and representation, at once philosophical, poetic, and religious. So here is my last concluding point. In yielding to its extra systematic other, to itself as another, philosophy ends. But this means precisely that philosophy goes on. It eternally creates and recreates itself, as it were, albeit in utterly different forms and in utterly different contents, namely in forms and contents that have no place within the system simply because they are not yet there. In its idea, philosophical thinking declares itself satisfied with what it has accomplished. Indeed, its activity rests in the act of sich genießen. Satisfied with itself, it lets it go of itself. The idea's final decision is the liberating movement of Freientlassen. Rooted in the historical world and fully actualized in it as Weltanschauung, philosophy is now consigned to different empirical subjects and different shapes of the world, to a reality that is not yet there, hence neither belongs, cannot belong to the system, nor to the present of Hegel's philosophy. The extra systematic world that constitutes the new stage for philosophy's new beginning, then, is a future world. It is most certainly our world, not something on which Hegel's philosophy can formulate its pronouncements, to be sure. We are, in fact, on our own here. But it is the world that is our task to grasp in concepts as philosophers coming after Hegel. It is a world that, in its turn, necessarily shapes philosophy in new ways. Thus, our historical world and our philosophical activity is a new beginning to which the end of the encyclopedia eventually opens up. The end is where we start from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nuzzo. That was really wonderful. So before we open up for a Q&A, I just want to bring up two things. So if you are hungry for more about the absolute idea and non-becoming transition into nature, we have a conference scheduled in September. It's going to take place in Warwick, hopefully in person, which is going to be on objectivity, nature, and idea. So you're all very welcome. Well, if you cannot make it physically, we shall try to also live stream it. And the second thing I want to say is that haven't been mentioned before, but want to say thanks to our sponsor for our conference, which is the Hegel Society of Great Britain. So thanks very much to them. All right then. So the procedure now is please raise your hand and please be succinct with your questions so that more people can have a chance to ask. So first one up is Sebastian Stein.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. It was very interesting and I thought very challenging with regards to the end of philosophy especially. I have two short questions. The first is when Hegel says that philosophy is a circle of circles, and he says that on a circle, strictly speaking, there is no beginning, middle, and end. How do you think this notion of philosophy as a circle can be applied to philosophy itself? So if philosophy is a circle of circles, and by definition there is no outside of the circle, in what sense does it make sense to speak of method on the circle with regards to beginning and end, especially since a method in the logic is followed by the idea that is for the idea. And that can be read as suggesting that Hegel thinks that this method-based talk of beginning, middle, and end is obsolete already at the end of the logic, where the idea that is for the idea has been reached. And the second question is, if there's something outside of philosophy and the system, what could it be? If Hegel thinks that all of the forms of spirit, all the possible forms of spirit are encompassed in the philosophy of spirit, then what would be outside of the system would have to be something not spiritual, and maybe something that is not up to us as spiritual beings. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. So circle of circles. I think I sort of mentioned that at the beginning of my paper. My take is to say this is definitely. Those are images. Images that help to a point. But now if we look at, certainly the end goes back to the beginning, okay? So to that extent, yes, there is a circle, but the end doesn't go back to exactly the same beginning from which it arises. So my view is that all the language of circularity is good once we use those terms in a sort of vague or sort of as images, or in the language of representation, they are certainly accurate, but in the language of the concept, they are not. So they help up to a point, but not too much. I don't think that the idea of beginning advancement and end is obsolete for Hegel. I think it's actually a very productive way to reconstruct and read the Hegelian system. And I think in the end, we are still in a sort of Aristotelian narrative way that is far from obsolete, I think. And I think it's really a very productive way to understand and reconstruct processes as processes. And I think that's all that Hegel philosophy is about. What can be outside of the system? Well, I mentioned that, I hinted at that at the end. I think the future is outside of the system. And by Hegel says philosophy cannot speak about the future. That's where the language of the concept ends, okay? It's not the task of philosophy to make prediction regarding the future, but the future is very much there for us. It's not there for Hegel's philosophy. So the only extra systematic thing is the future world, okay? And that's where Hegel's philosophy ends. But philosophy doesn't end because the world doesn't end, okay? So that was my, my conclusion is the end of philosophy is getting us at the threshold of the present. I mean, this ties up, if you want, with those super famous quotes that we can repeat from the preface of the Philosophy of Right, okay? Philosophy comes always too late, but it gets right to the edge. As much as it comes too late, it can't go on one step further. So that's the rootedness of philosophy into its world. Okay? And that, to me, is that meaning of that Weltanschauung that Hegel himself is really mentioning in his Notiz.
Okay. Right, thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Dylan Shaw.
Hi, Angelica. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, and also the wonderful answer to the first question, which just makes me want to ask something in a way to follow up. I mean, I have a great agreement with this, all the connection you drew between the absolute idea, the end of the logic, the free release into nature, the absolute liberation of the absolute idea, and then the end of the encyclopedia as a whole, philosophy, you might say the absolute liberation of absolute spirit, kind of free release that the philosopher undergoes, which in one sense, if we just think of the circle naively, would be a free release into being. But I think the much, more interesting in a way, piece is that, well, in a way, we're releasing ourselves, freeing ourselves from philosophy itself, I take it. So, and I think back to Wittgenstein, which is a weird thing for me to think, but he says, the real discovery is the one which enables me to stop doing philosophy when I want to. The one that gives philosophy peace so that it is no longer tormented by questions which bring itself into question. So, to this idea that we have to give the philosopher peace and they can stop doing philosophy and now they can actually, in a way, act, wouldn't it be, according to what you've said to the previous question, that is to free us from the past so we can enjoy the present and create a new future, which philosophy precisely is not in the business of telling us what the future will hold, both in the sense that it can't predict the future, but also that philosophy can't instruct us on what we ought to do, which is Hegel's great expression of philosophical humility. I think it's up to us to decide what the future will hold. Philosophy can only set us free to make that future what we will. And so I wonder whether that picture strikes you as an agreement with what you've said, and more speculatively, what is this freedom then that we have or must have in order to make this new future? On what basis, now that we've been set free from philosophy, shall we say, if that's the picture, on what basis can we decide how to act or how to make this new future that philosophy can't tell us about, as it were? Okay, that's probably, I've gone on just because of these are the great questions I think that Hegel brings us to. So thank you again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dylan, for yes, I am basically in agreement with everything that you said, and I just want to reiterate what I think the highest wisdom, philosophical wisdom, is knowing when to stop and let go. So the lesson here is really, we can't keep ruminating over the same things over and over, thinking we're going to discover who knows what. So you said the philosopher is the freedom to know that the philosopher can stop doing philosophy. And I would simply tweak it and say the philosopher should stop doing philosophy and let go and change. I mean, what is really the underlying interesting thing to me is this idea of how do we change the ways we think in a really radical way. And, and I've been thinking a lot about the fact that, you take the Kantian idea of transcendental freedom or spontaneity is the capacity to make an absolute beginning. We may think that creativity is that capacity to do something first, the absolute beginning of the action. And I tend to think what Hegel is teaching us, that the real freedom is the capacity to make the end. Because only once we really stop, we know when to stop, and we completely let go, then we're going to be free to make a new beginning. And in that sense, I think the challenge is really to think of a form of doing philosophy that is really new in that sense, okay? So as much as Hegel is teaching us that philosophy is rooted in the historical world and owes everything to the past, is also true that there are those epochal cuts that determine new ways, and that's exactly what freedom and the freedom of thinking is. So if we are to take the Hegelian lesson and bring it on into our world, I think the lesson is really to I think that now the ways in which philosophy has to be shaped in our world comes from listening to the shape of the world. Okay, so precisely that kind of objectivity and materiality that is not the Hegelian one. And only starting from there can we reinvent philosophical thinking. So in a sense, philosophy doesn't end. Philosophy is ongoing. But to the extent that philosophy is shaped by a different world, philosophy has to be different in a substantial way. But obviously,
Thank you.
Could have been much more to say on this. Okay.
All right, our next question comes from Professor Schick.
Yes, hello to Angelica.
Hello.
Thanks for your really inspiring talk. I would have a lot of questions, but I put forward only one of them concerning the end of philosophy cashed out in terms of intellectual intuition as the perspective, new beginning, the new form of thinking. I think it's quite challenging to put into play intellectual intuition because intuition seems to be a kind of or bring with it a kind of immediacy of having it all in one moment, the totality, which seems to be at odds with Hegel's repeated admonita, repeated remarks against this desire for, or this ideal of having it in this immediate way. And he's just always pointing to the patience of unfolding it and to translate representation and images into concept, into discursive thinking. That is philosophy's task. So I'm wondering about intellectual intuition. Really. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, first let me say intellectual intuition, here you shouldn't be thinking of anyone like Kant, Schelling or Fichte, okay? But so what I meant is this, okay, Hegel has given us the lesson that you wonderfully repeated, okay? So philosophy doesn't deal with intuition, with that immediacy, is the patience of the concept, is that labor. This is what we should keep in mind. This is what has made philosophy throughout its journey from the beginning to the end of the encyclopedia. Now I take it that in a generic way, we could say, well, those three syllogisms is the most paradigmatic way in which discursivity affirms itself. Total mediation, structure of discursivity, syllogistic mediation, insisted on all the possible permutations. Now, we get to that point, and what philosophy now can do, okay, and I want to suggest only at this final point, philosophy can open itself to its radical other in terms of ways of thinking, okay? So this suggestion is now intuition, now perhaps, see how that final line has always troubled me. Betätige, erzeugt und genießt, the last word of the encyclopedia. And I would say at this final stage, thinking in its radical discursivity can say, okay, at this point, open to the other, and the other is intuition. So when Hegel in his Notiz says Überblick, I bring it specularly face to face with the three syllogisms. The three syllogism is a radical discursivity of the grasp of the whole in the radically discursive way. Überblick is the grasp of the whole in its radical opposite, in that intuitive thing. So I think that now, only at this point, only after having gone through the radical discursivity, we can say, I can encompass, okay, philosophy can capitalize on its other, which is intuition. So, so now the suggestion is carrying it on and thinking of being Hegelians, okay, after Hegel. Maybe we should learn something from intuition as well. Even taking that, even assuming that our method remains, I'm committed to discursivity. So I want an intuition that is intellectual in the sense that steers me in certain directions. So the intellectual is, or the discursive remains my commitment to philosophy, but maybe we shouldn't throw out intuition completely. So I don't know. This is how I would answer to your question, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Professor Huget.
Okay. Thank you very much, Angelica. I really enjoyed this. Great to hear you talk again. Needless to say, I mean, I agree very much with your understanding of the end of the logic. And I've, benefited greatly from your understanding of that, and I'll be honest, pinch some of your ideas. So I'm really, really grateful for that, particularly when you say, only at the end does it make sense to talk of beginning, progress, and end. And you highlight the way that the idea releases itself as nature. However,
Yeah.
yes, sorry about that. Yes, but I wanted to butter you up first. I do want to suggest a different way of understanding the end of philosophy, but a way that I hope preserves something of perhaps what you want. I do think that you're drawing too close an analogy between the end of the logic and the end of philosophy, in that there is something from logic to move on to, but it's not clear that there's anything obvious to move onto. And it's interesting that I read those last words very differently from you. In fact, I was looking at them before you mentioned them. This idea that the idea sich betätigt, erzeugt und genießt, it activates itself, it produces itself and enjoys itself. I guess the way that I understand that is that what we reach at the end of philosophy, is a living in and enjoying of the understanding that's achieved by philosophy. So philosophy doesn't end in the sense that it just stops. We reach an understanding and then we enjoy and live in that understanding. And he comments that this is not only the self-enjoyment of the idea, it's die Tätigkeit des Erkennens. So they're two sides of the same thing. I don't know whether this is a rather silly analogy, but I think of it as rather like learning a language. You know, when one learns a language, one doesn't stop and say, well, you live in that language. You live in that understanding. Now, it seems to me that this is important because for two reasons. One, that understanding itself recognizes and presupposes the need for non-philosophical ways of life. It is, in that sense, if you like, parasitic on life in an economy, life in art, life in philosophy. So in that sense, it lets go of itself. It doesn't claim complete hegemony over our lives, because we can't philosophize unless we're alive, unless we eat, unless we have relationships, unless we're having an economic and political life and so on. So that sense of the non-philosophical that you are talking about as coming, as it were, if you like, after the end of philosophy, seems to me something that philosophy already requires and sanctions and justifies. And that includes intuition, of course, most obviously in art, but also in feeling and emotion and et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing I think that's important, and this I think is where I disagree with, was it the implication of Dylan's question earlier, and I think this is what you were also saying, is that I guess I'm not convinced, at least for Hegel, that the understanding we've achieved is not still valid for the future. We can't predict the future. But I don't think Hegel, in his wildest dreams, is thinking that there would come a point in the future where to be finite would mean not ending. No, to be finite means ending. It always means ending. It will never not mean ending. Or will there be a time at which unrestricted greed in civil society will not produce poverty? No, it won't. Unrestricted greed in civil society will produce poverty. Now, we might, similarly, freedom requires, he thinks, life in the state organized in a certain way. Now, we might destroy the state, for example. So we can't predict how we will live. We might destroy freedom. We might destroy the planet. But what it would mean to be free, to be finite, and so on, I think Hegel thinks at least that we understand that and we live in that understanding. And I guess, so I do disagree with you, but I guess the point of my question was, how do you respond to that last point? Do you think that that this openness you're talking about is so open that there could indeed be revisions to the way, let's say, Hegel understands desire or the structure of the civil society thinks a good one? I mean, is it conceivable that we could have unrestricted greed that doesn't impoverish people? That seems to me quite an important question to ask. Is it, you know, so I'll stop at that. I mean, you've seen the question.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. That's great. I do, okay, I do agree with you that those last words of the encyclopedia, and I mean, other speakers before me during this conference have talked about this. What those words imply is the pleasure of doing philosophy, the living in the understanding of philosophy. And actually, you tie it to the quote of Aristotle, which is that's another issue in itself, but it underlines those things, okay? Thinking as being alive, has that pleasure, and so on and so forth. Yes, but so that what strikes me as problematic is how is that then just a repetition of what philosophy has been? so are we just, of course, philosophy doesn't end, and in this idea of being alive and enjoying itself, is that this kind of completely a divine form of thinking in this eternal present? Well, no, it's giving us an intimation of how we carry on. Okay, I want to see it not just a repetition of what has been already presented within philosophy, okay, within Hegel's philosophy. So in that sense, I wanted to say in this moment of ending, there is a hint of what that pleasure of and that living in the understanding, and probably in a non-philosophical dimension, should be taken on into a different kind of practice. But this is how I would say, I would answer to your second point. I think the fact is that philosophy is not just about the world. Philosophy is also shaped by the world. In that sense, this second aspect, if you want, this is what Marx is taking on. And, you know, any kind of conceptual apparatus, such as the Hegelian, is, if we want to take it as a device to understand the world, we should also be cognizant of the fact that that conceptual apparatus is shaped in turn by the world. And in that sense, Hegel's theory of desire may not change, but if we want to understand what desire is in probably in our you know, age of a lot of other things, virtual surveillance capitalism, desire changes, and our conceptual apparatus has to change. We can still be Hegelians, but the notion of desire has to change because the world is changing, and it's changing the way we think the world. So in that sense, I think we have to make that, acknowledge that other side of the problem, how concepts cannot remain the same. If we want to
just to follow up, but just one brief point. You mentioned repetition, that you know, on the idea I was putting forward, do we not just sort of end up repeating philosophy?
Yeah.
I guess my worry is that if we move on from or lose the understanding we've achieved, we just end up repeating the problems of the past. And what's so interesting is, I guess I'm not convinced that our world is as new as perhaps you're taking it to be. What strikes me is how much our world owes to Verstand, to understanding, to early forms of materialism or capitalism or romanticism. And so there's a question mark about actually how new our world really is. And we just seem to be repeating the same old problems that Hegel, and indeed not just Hegel, others have analyzed. And we blithely go along repeating them because we've lost the understanding of what it is to live a proper human life.
Yeah, okay, so let's put it this way. The world may not be that new, but if we keep thinking about this world in the same ways, we are stuck. Okay, so what I'm saying is we have to strike a balance between being stuck, okay, being stuck in the same kind of paradigm. Okay, let's think about this whole pandemic business, okay, and how you just hear, when are we going to be able to go back to normal? Okay, it's all about going back to normal. What is normal? The past? Are we going to ever go back to normal? No, we're not. So if our thinking is just thinking projected onto the past, onto that normalcy, onto that is what Hegel calls a dead positive. We have, our thinking has to catch up to that dead positive and recognize that it's dead. Okay, so so yes, our world may not be totally new, and this is really the challenge, okay, to recognize that somehow we have to shake up our ways of thinking and take that step. Otherwise, we're really going to be trapped in the dead positive. Okay, so so to me, it's much more difficult to have a new way of thinking about a world that is not so new than you know, that is really the challenge. Okay, and of course I believe that you take Hegel's logic. Okay, that is our hermeneutic tool to approach the world, but what is necessary is to make that connection so that how do we break away from that dead positive? That is my problem, because being stuck is the most dangerous thing. And being stuck thinking that you're really inventing new things is even worse, right? So.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Anyway, that was great. I'll let other people come in. Thanks a lot, Angelica.
Yeah.
So we're nearing the end of our session. So I wanted to ask Professor Nuzzo if you want to end it here, or are you okay with taking a few more questions?
No, I'm okay. You can go on with a couple more questions.
All right, there we go. We go on. So next question comes from Bruna.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Angelica, for your amazing paper. Okay, I just have a question, quick question. And yeah, well, it has to do with the way you presented the conclusion of, like, if I understood you well, sure. Like you presented the conclusion of every part of the encyclopedia, for example, of the logic, namely that once the logic is concluded, nothing else can be made, in this case, like with logical eyes, that we, like once the logic is concluded, then we should like proceed in the way of the circle of the nature, for example. Then there would not be a necessary relation, even a relation between the different parts of the system. And then, well, my question is very quick. How, in the terms you presented the conclusion of every part of the encyclopedia or the system, how would you explain the relation between the different parts of the system? And for example, how would you explain then the real origin of the categories, for example? That's my quick question.
Yeah. So I take it that so when you reach the end of the logic, of course, you have the generation of a successive system of new determinations. But those new determinations are not determinations of pure logical thinking or the pure concept, are determinations of the concept of nature. Okay, so the relation of the different parts of the system is really connected. We have to look at those transitions. Okay, so there is a sense in which the logic is the basis. Okay, take that passage in the introductory chapter to the logic of the concept, where Hegel is saying the concept without is that skeleton, okay? He uses that word, and it's before taking into account the concrete determination of the concept as nature, as spirit. Okay, so there you have the systematic relation already. So somehow the structure of the concept is the underlying basis, but after the logic, okay, any further determination of the concept is not a logical determination, because otherwise you would say the logic is not concluded, okay, it's not complete. To the idea of completeness, it belongs that all possible logical determinations have been derived, okay? So obviously the process goes on, but it doesn't go on as logic. Okay, so here I would say you have a totality that is the movement of thinking in the system, and then is specified thinking as logical thinking, the concept as pure concept, and thinking as embedded in the determinations of nature and spirit. So, and you see that what Hegel is really doing, if you look at those initial sections of the philosophy of nature and spirit, he's telling you what is the material peculiarity of the medium or the element of nature, how that is interacting on the movement of the concept, what makes the specificity of a philosophy of nature or spirit. So this is really something that is very relevant for Hegel. That's why he has those introductory paragraphs in which he's telling us how the movement occurs in nature. Okay. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
I'm going to sneak in a question of my own at this point. So I want to ask you a bit about the novelty or the moments of the intellectual intuition or the new that is coming in to the picture, if that is indeed the case. So, so I'm wondering if Hegel's philosophy, or perhaps philosophy more broadly, doesn't offer us certain guarantees or things we can minimally expect of what's to come. And so it seems to me that freedom for Hegel is importantly development. It's self-determination. And it's not enough for something to be simply spontaneous or immediate. It has to sort of develop or follow a certain path or integrate things outside of itself and then make its own character on the basis of that. And as far as Hegel explicates that, that turns out to be systematic. And then my question is whether what is in the future, we haven't, like based on coming from Hegel, we haven't good reasons to think of it as systematic in nature, such that it can be perhaps incorporated, or that whatever the future brings then incorporates, you know, Hegel and previous philosophers as part of a further development. So is it really extra systematic then, is the question.
Well, what does extra systematic mean? So the idea is when we reach the conclusive moment, okay, any kind of self-comprehension, okay, it's a self-comprehension of the absolute idea, of the idea of philosophy, is this retrospective looking back. Now, this retrospective looking back and encompassing all that has been previously gone through is not exactly the same thing as the going through the first time. Okay, we're learning something. Okay, so it's not the repetition of the whole, so much so that what you have in the end, you have those three syllogisms. Okay, so you have a reconfiguration of the system. Okay, but everything is within the system. Okay, so now that is the idea of that all truth. It means that if there is another truth, it doesn't belong to the system. But if it doesn't belong to the system, then the system is not the system. Okay, so it cannot be what you have at the end. Okay, cannot be an extra determination. Okay, that still hasn't been covered by the system, okay? Because otherwise the system wouldn't be complete. So what does extra systematic mean? Well, it can mean subjective, okay? For the reader of the system, you have extra systematic considerations, okay? It cannot be a determination that has not been covered by the system itself, because otherwise the system wouldn't be complete, okay? But now extra systematic here, what I'm saying is something that is not there yet, okay, can be an extra systematic, not for the standpoint, this is the nature of history, okay? It goes on. So that's a problem. What is the extra systematic? Either is you take it as being a contingent, okay? Again, the encyclopedia is the system im Grundrisse, and you can say, well, this is what Kant has tells you what is a metaphysics of morals. That right, that first paragraph, he says, well, we're not dealing with the details, material details. That's not what a metaphysics is the principles. We're dealing with principles, okay? But when we're talking about principles, that metaphysics is complete in that regard. So this is how I take it, okay? So there must be some extra systematic, because, you know, that's exactly what comes after the end, if that is the end of the system.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question comes then from Ahilleas.
Hello, Tommy. Hi, Angelica. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm afraid my question is very much following the tradition that has just followed. Just because you're emphasizing that this extra systematicity, the new conceptual material, to sort of arrive at it, to understand it, we should still sort of continue with our Hegelian tradition, but sort of move it forward. And one question, my question really has to do with the method of this movement forward. If, as I take sort of Hegel's great contribution to method, it is that the reason why we take the concepts that he gives us so seriously is because they're sort of deduced from each other, and we sort of say that they're necessary deduced from each other, so on and so forth. I wonder, when we are in the project of deriving or deducing new categories, how this would proceed. Would it be very technical and sort of formalistic? Would it be like a category that follows after the encyclopedia? Would it be a completely new category, something like a pure being sort of scenario, where we're thinking something new in its immediacy, and then we proceed forward? How do you understand this method?
Right. Yeah. So no, I don't think you need to invent new categories. You don't need to do like Vittorio Hösler, who is adding some categories at the end of the logic. Okay. So the logic is perfectly fine as is. Okay. Okay. So this is what I'm thinking is simply doing what Hegel himself is doing, and what I was saying before in answering to Bruna. So Hegel is saying, and this is the big issue of the relation between the logic and the real philosophy. Okay, if the logic is a conceptual tool for the understanding of reality, I really don't think that Hegel thinks that you apply this instrument to reality. Okay, there is neither the idea of application nor the idea of instrumentality. Okay, somehow look at how he's, I'm repeating what I was saying before, he's opening the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit. The categories of the logic interact with the element of nature and with the element of spirit, and something changes. Okay, for example, in spirit, Hegel is saying in nature there is contingency that has its own rights. Okay, there are many considerations that Hegel is using. There isn't really an Entwicklung in nature because of the contingency makes the forms of nature remain behind the way they do. In spirit, you have other interactions between the pure logical form and what is peculiar to spirit. So I think what Hegel is recognizing there is that although the logic is absolutely complete in itself, okay, there are no more logical determinations, but the way in which the logic is embodied and alive and an instrument of philosophical comprehension in different elements, in different spheres of the real, changes. Okay, so now what I think is that it could be that not the logic, but the real is presenting new challenges to comprehension. And for that, what we have to be ready to do is to see how Hegel's logic is not that, precisely as we were saying, those forms are alive, and to be alive means to have to change, to have to adapt, to have to, if you're too rigid, you're gonna miss things. So somehow, if we really wanna use the logical forms in a productive way, we have to see how those forms are going to interact when the element is different. Okay, the element being the real medium. And now Stephen is saying, well, maybe that real medium is not so new. Okay, maybe not, but maybe even if it's not so new, we can look at it in somehow a different way.
Okay. Well, yeah. Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Sure.
But what about the idea that, I mean, so if we don't think that Hegel, the philosophy of nature and spirit, and so on and so forth, if they don't develop necessarily, if we don't think that their development is sort of bound by the same necessity as the logic, I mean, how can we even come to conclusions about philosophy at the end of the system? I mean, how can we think that philosophy is what we think it is if we haven't proceeded with certainty until the end.
Okay, can you repeat, because you said there is a little echo in where.
Yeah, if the philosophy of nature and spirit and the whole encyclopedia doesn't proceed with necessity, with a kind of necessity that is not identical with the logic, but similar, isn't it problematic then that we're going to draw a conclusion, and then the system concludes with philosophy? Isn't it problematic that we're going to say, having concluded this system with and understanding philosophy in this sense, that the way we got to this position is not necessary, is not sort of fixed or rigid?
Well, I don't think we have to make sure we understand what necessity is. Necessity doesn't mean rigidity or I think we have to discuss what we mean by necessity. Okay, I do see that there is a necessity. I mean, it's not totally, it's not random. So I'm not sure. I don't want to deny the necessity. I mean, there is a necessary way in which thinking proceeds. I'm not denying that. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, we will now end the session and come to the end of our conference. Thank you once again, Professor Nuzzo, for this really provocative and rich talk. And thanks to everybody.
Thank you and the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and thanks everybody who's been with us today and before. It's been a really great, great journey.
Yes, it's been a pleasure to meet you all. It was lovely to hear all your talks. I hope we see each other again.
Yes, I hope we all get a chance to meet in person and take the philosophy into real philosophy.
And as the representative of the Hegel Society here, I'd just like to thank the organizers as well. I mean, they are my PhD students, but regardless of that, I think the way you organize this has been absolutely splendid. So I'm only sorry that I wasn't able to attend some of the earlier sessions, but and thank you all around the world for participating in this, and Friederike and Angelica and others. It's great to see you. Bruno, I've not met you before, but it's great. We've been in touch. So it's great to see you all. This is one advantage of the virtual world.
Yes, yes.
Good. Yeah. So good. Well, I hope that when we do this next year, maybe, I don't know, can we have some combination of actually sort of being live and being virtual at the same time? Is that a new possibility that Hegel hadn't thought about?
Okay.
Yeah, certainly.
Good. Okay.
Good. Okay.
Right,
bye.
Mert, do you want to have closing remarks?
Oh, not really. Like, thank you all really for participating and for the all inspiring papers. Like, it was a brilliant conference.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Great to see you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day. Have a great week.
Bye. Thank you.
Keep on philosophizing, even when it stops.